But right now, we are honored to have a special guest in the studio with us. And for those of you who've been paid attention to Tea Party politics over the years, you may remember this. Hold on, are we potted up over here on the stinger, Kelly? Sorry. There we go.
Before they take the Constitution and they turn it into some kind of huge elastic document that they try to wrap around everything. If you read our founding fathers, even they said that the General Welfare Clause, which is what she's probably going to try to use to explain this, even the General Welfare Clause, our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, Benjamin Franklin, and so on, so on, so on, every one of them said that the General Welfare Clause is only to be used within the confines of the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. Claire McCaskill, I'm not so much looking for an explanation from her as I'm looking for an apology.
That is Paul Curtman taking on then Senator McCaskill, or at least a representative of hers, at a town hall meeting back in 2009 before he stepped into political life. And today he's announced an exploratory committee to look into running against her for the United States Senate seat. Paul Curtman, state representative, is in studio with us. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me on today also.
It's a big step.
It is a big step. But, since that happened, there have been people talking to me about doing that eventually. And quite frankly, I thought we were going to make Claire McCaskill a private citizen about 6 years ago, but we missed our chance.
Well, yeah, that's true. And that's unfortunate. I read an article today, Paul, that she has amassed a $3 million war chest. And obviously, whenever you get into a race like this, as you've known in a much smaller scale at the state representative level, you've got to come up with cash to fight a battle like that. Now, assuming you get the nomination, that's there. But even in the primary, it's going to take a lot of fundraising. What's gone through your mind as you approach this race?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we're launching an exploratory committee, because what's going to be important to do is it's going to be important to campaign around the state under an exploratory effort to make sure that we know that the viability is there. And I don't care how big Claire McCaskill's war chest is. The voters in Missouri are some very resilient and resourceful people. And time and time again, whenever they've had an opportunity to speak on Election Day, whether it's been candidates or issues, they consistently vote for conservative values, especially when it comes to issues. So it doesn't matter how big her war chest is, how much money she's got. We've got a lot of conservative voters in the state, and they can't be bought.
No. I can just imagine, knowing you for the period of time that I've known you and listened to you speak, that you're chomping at the bit to get one-on-one in a debate with Claire McCaskill.
I'd love to do it. I would love to do it.
What's the big issue here, then? I mean, are you going to be talking, do you think, about health care? You're going to be talking about the fact that Claire McCaskill has tacked to the left, as she normally does, right up until election time, when she suddenly becomes a centrist again.
Yeah. Yeah, that's certainly a big part of it. Certainly health care. I mean, she was the deciding vote on Obamacare. And now that that's falling apart, she's complaining as though it's the Republicans' fault that, health insurance companies are pulling out of counties. And I think another thing is, too, I think she's just disconnected with the voters from our state. She's going around the state right now having all these town hall meetings as though it's normal for her. It's not normal. She hasn't been having town hall meetings over the last 6 or 8 years. She just hasn't been doing it. And people in Missouri are wise. They see that. They know that she's playing a political game because it's coming up on election time, but in particular, a tough election for her. And I think they're going to see right through that and see she's just another politician. She is the status quo.
Right. She's... even before you announced, before anybody had technically announced, everybody was still waiting to hear what Ann Wagner was going to do. There was a lot of discussion about the fact that she was going to face an uphill battle anyway, that Trump won by 19 points and to hang on to her seat was going to be tough. In fact, I think it was the Missouri Scout ran a couple of polls last week. And although your name wasn't one of the ones they put in that poll, any Republican name they ran against her beat her by, I think, a minimum of 5 points, if I read that properly. That's got to be reason for enthusiasm right there.
Oh, absolutely. I think so. I mean, when you look at poll numbers she didn't win. I mean, that was basically against a general viable Republican candidate.
Right.
She loses against all of them.
Somebody drawing breath. She's losing. She's losing. And I know that we've talked about that a lot on this program, that there's a frustration out there, and I think Trump partly represents that. There's a frustration on the part of people who for years have been hearing politicians talk the talk, and then they get elected and they go down and they go along to get along, and You fought that trend at the state level, and I'd be anxious to see what you could do at the federal level.
You know, at the state level, it was difficult because when we first got elected back in 2010, there was a number of good, solid conservatives, and you really have to fight not just for the bills and for the issues, but it's a fight to change the culture. It is a fight to change the culture as far as what type of principles people are looking to push, what type of agendas they're looking to push. I helped co-found the Conservative Caucus, and we started with about 15 members. Now we're rolling about 40 members, and the culture is beginning to change. I remember some of the issues that we first voted on a lot when I first got there: corporate welfare, transferable targeted tax credits, tax subsidies, constantly. And we've changed the culture a little bit. We're having serious discussions about that. Governor Greitens is on board, wanting to rein those back in. I haven't had to vote on one of those in a couple years now. Yeah. So the fight is the issues and also just changing the culture.
Well, I know you've been downtown since this morning because you were on Allman in the morning. Have you had a chance to, have you listened to any of the changes they've made to this health care plan in the Senate side? It just came out a few minutes ago, and we're going to get into it a little later on the show. But the discouraging thing about it is that I've heard people like Rand Paul and Ted Cruz stand up and say, listen, I ran on a platform of repealing this monstrosity and then replacing it with something else. And I just printed out, I don't know, probably about 45 pages of a 175-page document that is the health care change in the Senate. And the first wording you come to about 3 pages into it from the top is that this section will amend the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. So what this bill is full of is amendments to the Affordable Care Act, but not getting rid of the Affordable Care Act. Mm-hmm. And you know, I'm happy that Paul and Cruz stand up. Would you see yourself in that role?
Absolutely. Listen, Republicans have campaigned for almost 8 years now on fully repealing Obamacare. That's what they campaigned on. That was the promise. So that is what needs to happen. That has to happen. And the replacement needs to be consumer. It needs to be, the whole package needs to be wrapped around empowering the consumer. And so that's what needs to happen. That's what we campaigned on, market-based solutions. That's the direction that we have to go.
Yeah, they don't, they're throwing, from what I can tell, about $100 billion at the states over the next 6 or 7 or 8 years for some kind of stabilization fund, maybe to stabilize Medicaid. I don't think that's part of the block grant program for Medicaid. It's confusing. You almost have to be a lawyer to read some of this stuff. That's something else that's been lost in the translation, hasn't it? I mean, we send our legislators up there, but for the average voter to try to look through something like this, it's gobbledygook. You can't understand what they're doing. And I think that's intentional.
I think it's the way the legislative process works. That's what it's become. And that's why in Missouri we like to stick to is single subjects. That's why we can't amend a bill onto another bill if it's going to turn into 2 different subjects that cover 2 different chapters of law. You know, it's something that they need to do at the federal level. These Christmas trees that they put on where it's just amendments to amend legislation. So you might have 170 pages of amendments, but in order to actually understand the full scope of the legislation, you're looking at like 70,000 pages that you're going to have to go through and find out what's being amended onto what and how things are changing. So it is highly complex and highly confusing.
Yeah, just like the tax code. What would your ideas be on simplifying the U.S. tax code? Because that's something that's going to be considered by, supposedly, in the next year or so. The Trump administration has been pushing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think everything's on the table as far as tax reform. I am not a fan of what income taxes do to productivity. Right. Income taxes just help incur a higher cost of labor, and it becomes a barrier to productivity and a barrier to prosperity. So graduated income taxes where you punish people the more successful they are, I don't think is a good idea for our country. I think a flat tax, a fair tax, something else other than something that punishes you for being successful. Punishment for being successful is not the American way.
Do you face this in Jeff City? And I suspect that if you do, it's a microcosm of the bigger problem you'd face in D.C. But my understanding is when it comes to tax reform, there are a number of lobbying groups who are out there trying to stop this, from the ones that represent the attorneys, the ones that represent the accountants. The last thing they want is that how many thousands of pages of tax law to be reduced to, a short stack.
Special interest, everybody wants their cut. And so I've seen tax commissions, I've seen tax study groups, and the people that sit on these, you'll have a handful of legislators, and you also have a handful of lobbyists and, you know, a citizen panel. I think that the citizens and their representatives maybe can be the ones to work it out, but the special interests have got to be cut out of it, because the special interests are there because everybody's fighting for their cut, what they can get out of it. The special interests can get out of it, and that is bad policy. That's bad government.
Right. So when you declare yourself officially a candidate, I know you just got an exploratory committee now for U.S. Senate. One of the issues that'll come up is foreign policy. You served in the military.
I did.
You served overseas too, correct?
Yes.
Yeah,
Marine
I
Corps.
thought so. Marine Corps. What's going to be your argument as to what qualifies you to go up there as the United States Senate and maybe potentially sit on the Armed Services Committee, something like that?
Well, first of all, I think our foreign policy starts with the Constitution. The reason in Article 1, Section 8 that Congress is charged with declaring war is because they're the ones that are supposed to be representative of the people. And if we ever go to war, it's the people that sacrifice their sons and daughters. It's the people that have to front all the money to cover the cost. And so anytime we go to war, it needs to be a reflection of the will of the people. And I also think that it's important that Congress be accountable. I remember when how politicized funding the troops, making sure that they had body armor and the equipment that they needed in the early days of the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan could have been. Congressmen have to be held accountable for it, and the Constitution has the prescription to make sure that that happens. I'm not a fan of policing the world. I think we have enough problems of our own. We have our borders that we got to protect. We have our own homeland security that we got to be aware and cognizant of. I don't think that we ought to be. John Quincy Adams had a great quote. He said, "America should not go in search of monsters to destroy, but if we want to change the world," and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, he said we need to be a light, like a shining light, a beacon of what liberty and freedom and the prosperity that it can bring. That's a great way to change the world. I'm with Trump on his foreign policy. When he campaigned, and he took very much a non-interventionist approach, like we got to be careful, let's not police the world. But in those cases where we got to put combat troops on the ground, let's start with the Constitution to make sure that there's some accountability. Our troops deserve nothing less.
Well put. Paul Curtman, a state representative who has announced a group to at least look into, what do you call it, an exploratory?
It's an exploratory committee because
Right.
we just got a campaign to make sure that there's the resources to launch a viable campaign.
And the website, I heard you mention it on Allman in the
Yes,
morning.
KurtmanforMissouri.com. You can go there, you can get involved, and you can see an event that we're planning for July 29th to kick that off.
It's exciting. Paul, congratulations.
Thank you.
Good luck. Let us know whenever you're down here, and we'll get you on the radio.
Will do. Thanks,
All
Mark.
right. Thank you. That's Paul.